They say there is no cure for Alzheimer's, that once the mind starts to fade, those memories are lost forever. But in the summer of 1995, inside a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, I witnessed a medical miracle that defied every textbook. My dying father found a way to unlock his confused mind and speak clearly again. But the key wasn't a doctor or a new drug. It was an old friend hiding in the woods, a visitor the rest of the world calls a monster, who sat on our back porch and kept a vigil that science is only just beginning to understand. Before we play the tapes, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you want to uncover more secrets hidden in the deep woods, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The farmhouse in Bucks County was built in 1920, a drafty, creaking thing that smelled of old wood and impending loss. In the summer of 1995, I moved back in, not as a son returning to his roots, but as a custodian to a collapsing dynasty of one. My name is Robert Mitchell. At 51, I was a structural engineer, accustomed to problems that could be solved with calculus and steel reinforcement. I built bridges. I understood how to keep things from falling down. But standing in the hallway of my childhood home, watching my father stare blankly at a wall he had painted 30 years ago, I realized I was facing a structural failure that no amount of engineering could fix. My father, James, was 78, but the man who raised me had been slowly eroding for 5 years. Alzheimer's is a thief that doesn't have the decency to break in once. It comes back every night to steal a little more. First, it was the keys, then the names of neighbors, and finally, the ability to recognize his own reflection. By the time I brought him home from the assisted living facility, he was a shell. The doctors called it advanced stage dementia, a clinical term that fails to capture the horror of looking into your father's eyes and seeing absolutely nothing looking back. I brought him home because the facility smelled like antiseptic and despair, and I couldn't bear the thought of him dying among strangers. I set up a hospital bed in the living room, moving the coffee table where we used to play checkers. I became a nurse, a cook, and a guard, trading my blueprints for medication schedules and adult diapers. It was a humiliating reversal of roles. The strong, silent man who had taught me to drive a tractor and shingle a roof was now dependent on me for his most basic dignity. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the hum of the oxygen concentrator and his occasional incoherent muttering. I approached caregiving with the rigid discipline of my profession. I kept logs. I tracked his fluid intake, his sleep cycles, and his moments of agitation. I was trying to impose order on a chaotic biological decline. I told myself that if I managed the variables, I could manage the disease. I was wrong. You can't engineer a solution to a brain that is physically deleting itself. I was fighting a war of attrition against biology, and I was losing ground every single day. The house became a prison for both of us, a capsule of time that was running out. The isolation was profound. Friends stopped visiting after the first year. People don't know what to say to a man who can't speak, so they stopped coming. My world shrank to the four walls of the farmhouse and the overgrown fields beyond. I spent my days talking to him, filling the silence with one-sided conversations about the weather or the news, desperate for a flicker of recognition. "It's hot today, Dad," I'd say. 90 degrees. He would just stare out the window, his hands trembling in his lap, picking at invisible threads on the blanket. James had been a man of the outdoors, a farmer and a hunter who knew every acre of these woods. Now he was confined to the indoors, trapped by his own frailty. I saw the frustration in his body language, the way he would pace the floor when his hips allowed it, testing the doorknobs I had to lock. He was like an old lion in a cage, sensing the world outside but unable to reach it. It broke my heart to keep him locked in, but I was terrified he would wander off into the cornfields and vanish, a common tragedy for men in his condition. The sundowning was the worst part. As the afternoon light faded, his confusion would spike. He would become agitated, shadowing me from room to room, asking for people who had been dead for 20 years. "Where is Martha?" he'd ask, his voice thin and panicked. My mother had died in 1985. Every evening, I had to break his heart anew or lie to him and say she was at the store. The twilight hours were a gauntlet of emotional exhaustion that left me drained, staring at the television with a whiskey in my hand after I finally got him to sleep. Despite his confusion, there was one ritual he clung to. Every evening after dinner, he wanted to sit on the back porch. It was a screened-in area facing the dense tree line of the state forest that bordered our land. I would wheel him out there, and he would sit in his old rocker, staring into the gathering dark. It was the only time he seemed at peace. The agitation of the sundowning would settle, replaced by a quiet vigil. I assumed he was just watching the fireflies or listening to the crickets, finding comfort in the sensory details of the night. I used those hours to catch up on work, or simply breathe. I would sit in the kitchen, watching him through the sliding glass door. He looked so small in the chair, a silhouette against the blue-black of the evening. I wondered what was going through his mind, if there were any coherent thoughts left in the static, or if he was just processing light and sound like a machine. I felt a profound guilt for wishing it would end, followed by a profound shame for thinking it. I was drowning in the slow-motion tragedy of it all. The summer of '95 was brutally hot, the air thick with humidity that made the porch feel like a greenhouse. Yet he insisted on being out there. He would become restless if I tried to keep him inside, banging his cane on the floor until I opened the door. It became our routine: dinner, medication, porch. I would leave him there for an hour, checking on him every 10 minutes. It was his time, and in a way, it was my time, a brief respite from the constant demands of the disease. Then, the behavior started to change. In late July, I noticed he wasn't just sitting there anymore. He was leaning forward. He was gesturing. Through the glass, I saw his head nodding, his hands moving in the animated way he used to talk when he was telling a story at the feed store. He was engaging with the empty space beyond the screen. At first, I dismissed it as another cruel symptom. Hallucinations are common in the late stages. The brain tries to fill the gaps in perception with fabricated data. I watched him one Tuesday night, mesmerized and horrified. He was laughing. It wasn't the vacant, confused chuckle of a dementia patient. It was a deep, resonant belly laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in 5 years. He slapped his knee. He pointed a finger at the darkness and said something I couldn't hear through the glass. It was chilling. My father was having a spirited conversation with the night, and for the first time in forever, he looked like himself. I decided I needed to know who or what he thought he was talking to, so I went to the closet and dug out my old RCA camcorder. The pattern was maddeningly consistent. Every evening at 7:30 p.m. as the sun dipped below the cornfields, James would demand to be wheeled out to the porch. If I delayed, he would become agitated, tapping his watch, a watch he no longer knew how to read, and muttering about being late. Once settled in his chair, the transformation would begin. He would lean forward, peering into the gloom of the overgrown backyard, his face lighting up with an expression of pure welcome. It wasn't the vacant stare of the day. It was the look of a man greeting an old friend at a bar. He would wave a trembling hand and say, "Right on time, you old rascal. Right on time." I watched this ritual from the darkened kitchen, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. To the naked eye, the backyard was empty. There was nothing out there but the rusted remains of a tractor and the encroaching wall of the state forest. Yet James was engaged in a full dialogue. He would speak, pause as if listening to a response, and then speak again. The pauses were timed perfectly, the rhythm of a natural conversation. He would nod in agreement, shake his head in sympathy, and occasionally slap the armrest of his chair. It was too structured to be the random firing of dying synapses. I tried to rationalize it with medical textbooks. I read about phantom borders and visual hallucinations common in Lewy body dementia. I told myself his brain was projecting memories onto the landscape, populating the emptiness with ghosts from his past. But the specificity of it gnawed at me. He looked at the exact same spot every night, a patch of darkness just beyond the porch screen, near the old oak stump. He didn't look around the yard. His gaze was fixed, focused, and unwavering. He was making eye contact with something that wasn't there. Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, I decided to document the episodes. I dug my old RCA camcorder out of the closet, the kind that rested on your shoulder like a bazooka and recorded onto full-sized VHS tapes. I felt ridiculous, like a spy in my own home, setting up a tripod in the living room and aiming the lens through the sliding glass door. I covered the red recording light with electrical tape so it wouldn't distract him. I wanted to capture the extent of his delusion, perhaps to show his neurologist that we needed to adjust his medication. On the night of August 14th, I pressed record. The tape whirred to life, capturing the grain of the low light. James sat on the porch, his silhouette framed against the twilight. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then he sat up straighter. "Well, look who finally dragged himself over," James said, his voice surprisingly clear. "How are the knees holding up today?" I zoomed in, watching the black and white viewfinder. The yard was a wall of static and shadow. I couldn't see anything, but James was clearly seeing a visitor. I let the tape run for the full hour. I sat on the floor of the living room, listening to my father talk. He spoke about the weather, about the corn, about the ache in his joints. It was mundane, comfortable chatter. But what unsettled me was the silence in between. In those pauses, I thought I could hear something. A low, resonant vibration that didn't sound like the wind. It was deep, almost below the threshold of hearing. Like the idling of a diesel engine or the purr of a massive cat. It rattled the glass in the doorframe just enough to be felt. Later that night, after I had put James to bed, I connected the camcorder to the television. I poured a drink and sat down to review the footage. The first few minutes were just as I had seen them, a sad, confused old man talking to the night. But as I turned the volume up, the audio profile changed. The microphone on the RCA was sensitive, designed to pick up dialogue at family picnics. It picked up the crickets, the wind, and something else. In the gaps where James paused, there were distinct vocalizations coming from outside the screen. They weren't words in English, but they were sounds of communication. Low grunts, soft chuffs, and a rumbling melodic hum that mimicked the cadence of speech. My blood ran cold. My father wasn't hallucinating a conversation, he was having one. I rewound the tape, playing the audio back over and over. James would ask a question, and the sound would answer. The timing was perfect. Whatever was out there was sentient, listening and responding. I stared at the dark TV screen, realizing the hallucination had a voice. I focused on the visual feed, adjusting the brightness and contrast on the television settings. The image was grainy, filled with the snow of high ISO recording. I scanned the area near the oak stump where James always looked. At first, it just looked like a shadow, but as I watched, the shadow moved. It didn't move like a tree swaying in the wind. It shifted weight. A massive, hulking shape detached itself from the background darkness and settled onto the stump. It was sitting down. I froze the frame. The resolution was poor, but the outline was unmistakable. It was a humanoid figure, massive in the shoulders, with a conical head that sat directly on the torso with no visible neck. It was covered in fur that absorbed the light. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't sit on stumps with their legs hanging down like a man. It wasn't a prowler. A prowler doesn't have shoulders 4 feet wide. It was a Sasquatch. A living, breathing legend was sitting 10 feet away from my father, separated only by a flimsy wire screen. I felt a surge of protective instinct, the urge to grab my gun and run to the window, but I forced myself to keep watching. The creature wasn't aggressive. It wasn't trying to breach the porch. It was simply sitting there, its posture slumped and relaxed. It looked old. Its movements were slow and deliberate, mirroring my father's own frailty. It leaned forward, resting its elbows on its knees, appearing to listen intently as James complained about the humidity. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that defied every monster movie I had ever seen. The most terrifying realization wasn't that Bigfoot was real. It was that my father knew him. This wasn't a chance encounter. The familiarity in James's voice, the relaxed posture of the creature. This was a scheduled meeting. I watched the tape until the static took over, my mind racing. I had expected to see evidence of my father's decline. Instead, I had found evidence of a secret life. And as I listened to James's voice on the recording again, I realized something even more shocking. For the duration of that conversation, he hadn't stuttered, forgotten a word, or lost his train of thought once. The days in the farmhouse remained a fog of confusion. I would spend the daylight hours guiding my father through the basic mechanics of existence, spoon-feeding him oatmeal, guiding him to the bathroom, and wiping the drool from his chin. He was a man untethered from time, drifting in a sea of fragmented nouns and lost verbs. He didn't know if I was his son, his brother, or the mailman. But as the sun touched the horizon and I wheeled him onto the porch, a switch would flip. The man who couldn't remember how to swallow his pills would suddenly sit up, adjust his collar, and greet the night with the diction of a radio broadcaster. It started with the syntax. For months, James had spoken in word salad, a jumbled mess of disconnected thoughts that made communication impossible. Shoot, water, blue, go now. It was the standard lexicon of the late stages, but in the presence of the creature, the sentences knit themselves back together. Subject, verb, object. The grammar returned. Did you see the frost on the pumpkins this morning? He asked the darkness one evening. It was a perfect, coherent sentence. I stood in the kitchen, stunned, holding a dish towel, listening to a ghost speak the language of the living. The clarity went deeper than just sentence structure. It accessed the vault of long-term memory. One night, James began recounting a story about the flood of 1955. He described the water rising over the bridge on County Road 9, the sound of the grand piano floating out of the neighbor's house, and the color of the mud. I hadn't heard that story in 10 years. He remembered the specific date, the names of the people who lost their barns, and the exact level of the river. The details were crystalline, retrieved from a hard drive I thought had been wiped clean by the disease. I tested the phenomenon, desperate to understand the variable. During the day, I would ask him about the flood. Dad, tell me about 55. He would look at me with watery, vacant eyes and mumble about the cat. The file was inaccessible, but that night, with the massive shape sitting on the stump just yards away, he picked up the narrative right where he left off. We lost 3 cows that Tuesday, he told the creature. Current took him right down to the Delaware. The creature let out a low, sympathetic rumble. It was the catalyst. Its presence was the key that unlocked the library. The transformation wasn't just mental, it was physical. In the house, James was plagued by the tremors of Parkinsonism, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold a cup of coffee. On the porch, the tremors ceased. I watched on the monitor as he lifted his hand to gesture, his fingers steady and precise. The tension in his shoulders dropped. The anxiety that defined his waking hours evaporated, replaced by a calm, dignified posture. It was as if the creature was broadcasting a frequency that stabilized his nervous system, grounding him in the moment. His emotional range expanded back to its original dimensions. Dementia often flattens a person's affect, leaving them in a state of apathy or irrational anger. But with his visitor, James laughed. It was a genuine, full-throated sound that shook his chest. He showed empathy, asking the creature about its well-being. "You're limping on that left side again," James observed one night. "Damp weather getting to the old break?" He was capable of observation and concern, traits I thought had been extinguished. He was being a friend. It became a heartbreaking paradox. I had my father back, but only for an hour a day, and only when he was talking to a monster. I felt a strange jealousy watching them. I wanted him to tell me the stories. I wanted him to ask about my day. But I was part of the confused world of the indoors, the world of doctors and diapers. The creature was the anchor to his past, to the woods, to the man he used to be. I was the nurse. The Sasquatch was the confidant. I had to settle for eavesdropping on his lucidity, grateful for the scraps of his personality that drifted through the screen. I began to analyze the conversations for clues about how this was possible. It wasn't just that the creature was familiar. It was that the creature engaged him. The low grunts and vocalizations from the dark weren't random. They were prompts. The creature would make a specific sound, and James would pivot to a new topic. "You're right," James would say. "That was the winter we had the ice storm." The creature was guiding the conversation, perhaps using sounds or pheromones that triggered specific associative pathways in James's brain. It was a form of therapy I couldn't replicate. The lucidity allowed James to express things he couldn't say to me. He spoke of his fear. "I'm losing it, old friend," he confessed one night, his voice trembling with a clarity that cut me to the bone. "The fog is getting thicker. Some days I don't know where the hell I am." It was the first time he had acknowledged his condition. He couldn't admit weakness to his son. He had to be the strong father. But he could confess his vulnerability to this silent giant. The creature chuffed softly, a sound of profound acceptance. It offered him a safe space to be broken. The medical implications were staggering. If I showed these tapes to a neurologist, they would say it was impossible. Brain tissue doesn't regenerate. Plaque tangles don't dissolve at sunset. Yet, the empirical evidence was playing out on my TV screen every night. The creature was accessing cognitive reserve, the brain's ability to improvise and find alternate neural pathways. Somehow the emotional connection and the specific sensory input of the creature were bypassing the damaged areas, firing up the dormant circuits of his mind. I realized that the person of James Mitchell hadn't been destroyed. He was just locked in a room without a door. The creature was the window. When the visitor left, usually around 9 p.m., the window slammed shut. James would slump back in his chair, the light fading from his eyes. By the time I wheeled him back into the kitchen, he was gone again, asking me who I was and why we were in this strange house. The transition was instant and brutal, a nightly death that I had to mourn over and over again. But in those precious 60 minutes, the timeline of his life was restored. He wasn't a patient. He was James. And as I listened to him talk, I began to notice the way he addressed the creature. He didn't speak to it with fear or awe. He spoke to it with a casual intimacy, using nicknames and inside references. "You're a stubborn old goat," he said fondly one evening. "Just like you were in '72. The date hung in the air, 1972. That was 23 years ago. This wasn't a new hallucination. This was a relationship that was older than I realized. The term old friend wasn't just a turn of phrase, it was a title. James used it every single night, pronouncing it with a reverence he usually reserved for his war buddies. "Evening, old friend," he would say, the words rolling off his tongue without a hint of the hesitation that plagued his daily speech. It implied a bond forged in fire, a history that didn't need to be explained. To hear my father, who couldn't remember my name or the fact that his wife was dead, identify this creature with absolute certainty was a testament to the depth of the connection. It was the only identity in his world that remained solid. The consistency of the recognition was the most jarring variable. With me, every morning was a reset button. I had to reintroduce myself and explain why I was in his house. But with the creature, there was never a moment of, "Who are you?" He picked up the conversation as if they had just paused for a coffee break. He knew the creature's quirks, his habits, and his personality. He anticipated his arrival. This wasn't the fleeting familiarity of a dream. It was the ingrained muscle memory of a decades-long association. The creature was as permanent in his mind as the sun or the moon. I started listening for dates. James would drop them casually into the narrative, providing coordinates for a timeline I knew nothing about. "Remember the blizzard of '78? He asked one night. "You sat on that stump for 3 days waiting for the snow to break so I could get to the barn." I froze. I remembered that blizzard. I was in college, and Dad had been alone on the farm. He had told me he survived by sheer luck. Now I knew he hadn't been alone. He had a guardian who sat in the snowdrifts, watching over the house when the roads were closed. The conversations revealed a shared geography. They talked about the upper ridge and the Black Hollow. places on the property that James hadn't hiked to in 20 years. He described specific trees, rock formations, and game trails with a hunter's precision. That big pine by the creek finally came down. James lamented. The creature let out a low, mourning moan in response. They were co-stewards of the land, two old men discussing the changing face of their neighborhood. They shared a mental map of the forest that was detailed, intimate, and inaccessible to anyone else. The intimacy extended to the creature's own life. James would ask about the little ones, inquiring about their growth or their whereabouts. "Is the young one still giving you trouble?" he asked, chuckling. "He's got your temper." It implied that James had watched generations of this family grow up. He wasn't just observing a solitary monster. He was a friend of the clan. He knew their lineage. He had likely watched the creature sitting on the stump grow from a juvenile into the massive, graying elder that sat there now. I felt a pang of profound exclusion. I was his son, his flesh and blood, but I was a stranger to this vast, secret chapter of his life. While I was off building bridges in the city, my father was building a bridge to another species. He had shared his solitude not with the Rotary Club or the church group, but with a Sasquatch. It explained why he never wanted to sell the farm, why he fought so hard to stay on this land. He wasn't protecting the real estate. He was protecting his neighbor. He was holding the line for his friend. The creature's body language confirmed the bond. A wild animal is skittish, reactive, always looking for an exit. But this being sat with the relaxed slump of a guy on a bar stool. He would stretch his legs out, cross his massive arms, and rest his chin on his chest. He exposed his throat, a sign of ultimate trust. He didn't scan the perimeter for threats because he knew he was safe. In the presence of my father, the monster de-escalated into a companion. They were just two tired souls resting in the dark. James often referenced a treaty or an agreement, though never in legal terms. "I left the apples by the shed," he would say, just like always. It spoke of a ritualized exchange, a commerce of goodwill that had sustained their friendship. It wasn't about the food. It was about the gesture. It was a language of gifts. I realized that the lost produce I used to complain about as a kid, the missing corn, the apples that vanished, hadn't been deer or raccoons. It was the rent my father paid to maintain the peace. One evening, James brought up a hunting rifle. "I still have the 30-06, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "but I haven't loaded it since the day we met. You know that." The creature grunted softly. It was an acknowledgement of a truce. James, the avid hunter, the man who had trophy bucks on the wall, had laid down his arms for this being. It suggested their first meeting might have been down the barrel of a gun, ending not in violence, but in a moment of mutual recognition that changed my father's ethics forever. The depth of the friendship transcended species barriers. They joked. James would tease the creature about his appetite or his smell. "You smell like wet dog and skunk cabbage tonight, old pal." And the creature would chuff, a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Humor requires a high level of cognitive empathy. You have to understand the other mind to tickle it. They shared a sense of the absurd. They found comfort in the same rhythms. It was a friendship stripped of all social pretense, raw and honest. The permanence of the relationship was the only thing that defied the Alzheimer's. The disease destroyed the memories of his wife, his career, and his childhood, but it couldn't erode the memory of the Bigfoot. That neural pathway was reinforced with something stronger than protein and electrical impulses. It was reinforced by the primal awe of the encounter. The creature was etched into the deepest, most lizard brain part of his consciousness, the part that survives when the higher functions fail. The monster was unforgettable. But as I watched the grainy footage of the creature shifting on the stump, I noticed something else. It took him a long time to stand up. He pushed off his knees with a groan that the microphone picked up clearly. He walked with a heavy limp, favoring his right hip. His fur was gray, thinning in patches on his shoulders. He wasn't a terrifying beast in his prime. He was old. He was hurting. And as I looked at my father's trembling hands and the creature's stiff gait, I realized they were mirroring each other. I began to study the visitor not as a cryptid, but as a biological organism in the late stages of its life cycle. The creature wasn't the hulking, invincible monster of folklore. Under the zoom of the lens, I saw the telltale signs of senescence. The fur around its muzzle and eyes had turned a stark, brittle white, contrasting sharply with the dark gray of its body. Its movements were economical, lacking the explosive power of youth. It lowered itself onto the stump with a grimace, favoring a right knee that looked swollen even from a distance. It was an old soldier, carrying the accumulated scar tissue of a life lived in the wild. The parallel between the two of them was striking and painful to witness. On one side of the screen sat my father, his body ravaged by the slow erosion of neurons and the stiffness of Parkinsonism. On the other side sat the Sasquatch, its massive frame bowed by gravity and arthritis. They were mirror images of decay, two patriarchs who had outlived their prime and were now navigating the twilight of their physical capabilities. When they looked at each other, they weren't seeing a human and a beast. They were seeing a fellow traveler on the road to the end. The effort required for the meeting was immense for both of them. I knew how much energy it took to get James out of bed, into the chair, and onto the porch. But I realized the creature was paying a similar price. I watched it approach one evening from the deep woods. It stopped every few yards to rest, leaning heavily against the trees, its breath pluming in the cool air. It wasn't patrolling, it was commuting. It was making a painful pilgrimage to sit on a stump for an hour. The fact that it continued to come, despite the obvious physical cost, spoke to the necessity of the interaction. Yet the moment they locked eyes, the years seemed to fall away. It was a phenomenon I called mutual resuscitation. James would straighten his spine, his tremors subsiding as his focus sharpened. The creature would perk up, its ears twitching forward, its posture lifting. They fed off each other's presence, trading a psychic energy that neither could generate alone. The isolation of their respective conditions, James trapped in his mind, the creature trapped in its solitude, was temporarily suspended. Together they formed a closed system where they were both whole again. They shared a language of complaints that only the elderly understand. James would rub his knuckles and say, "The damp is getting into the bones tonight." The creature would respond with a low, vibrating groan and shift its weight, rubbing its own massive shoulder. It was a commiseration of aches and pains, a validation of suffering that didn't require pity. I couldn't offer that to my father. I was 51 and healthy. I couldn't understand the specific frustration of a body that refused to obey orders. The Bigfoot could. The clarity they achieved was a direct result of this shared state. By acknowledging their decline, they seemed to transcend it. They didn't have to pretend to be strong for each other. James didn't have to play the father figure, and the creature didn't have to be the apex predator. They could just be two tired beings resting by the fire of their friendship. This lack of pretense cleared the mental fog. James wasn't anxious about forgetting things, because the creature didn't judge him. The safety of the environment allowed his brain to relax and function. I realized that loneliness is a neurotoxin. For James, the days were a long, lonely hallway of confusion. But for the creature, the loneliness must have been existential. Was he the last of his specific troop? Had his mate passed? He sat on that stump with the heavy gravity of a survivor. Finding James was likely his only tether to a social existence. They were keeping each other alive, not with food or medicine, but with the simple, potent medicine of being known. They were refusing to fade away into the silence. The relationship was symbiotic. James provided the creature with a window into a world of human abstract thought, stories, news, the concept of a flood in 55. The creature provided James with a connection to the primal, the sensory, the now. When James drifted, the creature would make a sharp sound, a click or a snap, bringing him back to the present. When the creature seemed to doze off, James would raise his voice slightly to rouse him. They were spotters for each other, ensuring the other didn't slip too far into the dark. Watching them made me realize the limitations of my own caregiving. I was attending to the mechanics of my father's life, the fluids, the pills, the hygiene. I was keeping the machine running, but the Sasquatch was attending to the pilot. He was engaging the soul. I felt a pang of failure, realizing that a wild animal was doing a better job of emotional support than I was. But I also felt gratitude. I couldn't be what James needed, but I could facilitate the meeting with the one who was. The silence they shared was as important as the words. Often they would sit for 10 or 15 minutes without a sound. In the house, silence was terrifying. It meant James was catatonic or lost. On the porch, the silence was companionable. It was the comfortable silence of old friends who have said everything that needs to be said. They watched the fireflies together. They listened to the owls. They were sharing the vigil of the night watch, united against the encroaching dark. As the summer turned to autumn, the decline accelerated for both. James was having harder days, more bad episodes where he didn't know me. The creature was arriving later, moving slower, its limp more pronounced. The urgency of their meetings increased. They seemed to sense that the clock was ticking down. The conversations became more reflective, focused on the past, on the good years. They were performing a life review, a final audit of their histories before the books closed for good. I found myself standing closer to the glass door, my hand resting on the handle. I was no longer content to be the observer, the spy with the camera. I wanted to be part of the circle. I wanted to thank this being for giving my father back to me, even if only in glimpses. I wanted to tell him that I saw him, that I respected him. I realized that to truly understand my father's final chapter, I couldn't just watch it on a screen. I had to step onto the porch. I had to cross the threshold and meet the visitor face to face. The decision to open the sliding glass door was the hardest engineering problem I had ever faced. It wasn't a calculation of structural load, but of trust. On a crisp Tuesday in October, when the harvest moon was bright enough to cast shadows, I decided I could no longer be a spectator in my father's life. I unlocked the latch with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. James didn't turn around, but the creature's head snapped up, its eyes reflecting the kitchen light with a distinct amber-green shine. It didn't flee. It froze, its muscles coiling under the gray fur, waiting to see what the intruder would do. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The air was cold, smelling of dried leaves and the faint, musky odor of the visitor, a scent like wet wool and pine resin. I moved slowly, keeping my hands visible, telegraphing that I was not a threat. I grabbed a folding chair and placed it near the wall, creating a triangle between myself, my father, and the stump. I sat down, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The creature let out a low, warning rumble, a vibration that I felt in the soles of my shoes. It was asking for my credentials. It was James who vouched for me. He looked at the creature, then at me, and for the first time in months, his eyes didn't slide past my face. He smiled, a genuine, recognition-filled smile. "It's all right, old friend," James said, his voice steady and reassuring. "This is the boy. This is Robert." He didn't say the nurse or the man. He said my name. He claimed me. In the presence of the creature, the fog cleared enough for him to find his son. The creature looked at James, then back at me, and let out a soft exhale, its shoulders dropping an inch. I had been vetted. The dynamic on the porch shifted instantly. I was no longer the warden. I was the guest. The creature, whom I began to think of as the guardian, accepted my presence as a necessary extension of James. I sat quietly for the first few nights, afraid to break the spell. I realized that my role wasn't to lead the conversation, but to facilitate it. When James would stumble on a word, getting stuck in a loop, I would gently supply it. "The Combine, Dad. You're talking about the Combine." He would nod, relieved, and continue his story to the Bigfoot. I became the translator between the human world and the wild. The proximity to the creature was overwhelming. Up close, the monster dissolved into biological reality. I saw the scars on its hands, the chipped fingernail on its left index finger, the intelligent, weary wrinkles around its eyes. It wasn't a supernatural being. It was a mortal organism. It would pick up a pine cone and roll it between its massive fingers, a fidgeting habit that mirrored my father's playing with his blanket. I saw it watching me with intense curiosity, studying my clothes, my glasses, the way I sat. We were two different species studying each other over the dying embers of a man we both loved. The most profound realization was that the creature already knew me. James had been talking to him for decades. One night, James pointed at me and told the creature, "He built that bridge in Pittsburgh, the big yellow one." The creature made a chuffing sound and looked at me with what I swear was recognition. He had heard the updates on my life for 30 years. While I was away at college, getting married, getting divorced, my father had been sitting on this porch telling a Sasquatch about my grades and my promotions. I had been part of their circle long before I ever stepped outside. The creature's presence acted as a stabilizing field for James's memory regarding me. Inside the house, I was a stranger, but on the porch, I was Robert. The creature seemed to anchor James to his identity as a father. Perhaps the creature knew James as a father, having seen him raise me, and that perception forced James to step back into the role. I found myself telling them both about my day, about the repairs on the barn roof. The creature would listen, tilting its head, acknowledging my contribution to the tribe's maintenance. I was being accepted into the pack. I began to bring offerings. It started with a bowl of apples placed on the railing. The creature waited until I sat down before reaching out with a long arm to take one. It ate with surprising delicacy, navigating the core. Then I brought coffee. James had his mug, I had mine, and I left a tin cup on the post for the guardian. He sniffed it, sneezed, and poured it out, which made James laugh until he coughed. He never developed a taste for the bean, James wheezed. Strictly water and creek juice. It was a moment of shared humor that bridged the three of us. I became the bridge in a literal sense as the weather turned. James was getting too frail to walk. I had to lift him from the wheelchair to the porch seat. The creature watched this transfer with hawk-like intensity. One night, I stumbled, my bad knee buckling under James's weight. The creature stood up abruptly, a terrifying vertical expansion of mass, and took a step toward the screen. It wasn't attacking. It was spotting me. It was prepared to catch my father if I dropped him. It sat back down only when we were settled, letting out a huff of concern. The conversations evolved into a three-way exchange. James would tell a story, I would add the details he missed, and the creature would provide the vocalizations that served as punctuation, agreement, skepticism, amusement. We created a rhythm. The porch became a sanctuary, a liminal space where the laws of medicine and biology were suspended. For an hour a night, my father wasn't dying, I wasn't grieving, and there were no monsters in the woods, only neighbors. It was the most normal I had felt in years, sitting in the dark with a madman and a beast. It was during these nights that I finally heard the apology I needed. James was looking at the creature but speaking to me. I was hard on the boy, he told the darkness. I pushed him away. It was a confession he couldn't make to my face, but he could make to the intermediary. I sat there, tears cooling on my cheeks, as the creature let out a low, mournful croon. It understood regret. It was validating my father's sorrow and, by extension, my own pain. The Bigfoot was the confessor, absorbing the sins of our family history and offering absolution in the form of silent companionship. But as November deepened, the cold became biting. The frost was heavy on the pumpkins in the morning. I noticed the creature shivering one night, hugging its massive arms to its chest. James was coughing more, his lungs rattling with the fluid of inactivity. The seasons were turning against us. The energy on the porch shifted from reconnection to a sense of impending departure. We were gathering not just to talk, but to hold the line against the winter. I looked at the gray in the creature's fur and the gray in my father's hair, and I knew that the bridge I had built was temporary. We were approaching the end of the road. February of 1996 brought a cold snap that froze the Delaware River. Inside the farmhouse, the timeline finally ran out. James stopped eating on a Monday, and by Wednesday he was in the Cheney-Stokes breathing pattern that signals the end. The porch visits had ceased weeks earlier. He was too weak to be moved, tethered to the bed by gravity and morphine. I spent those final days shifting his position and wetting his lips with a sponge, listening to the wind howl against the siding. The house felt suspended in a vacuum, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the center. He passed at 3:15 a.m. on a Thursday. It wasn't cinematic. The breathing just stopped, the machinery of his body finally grinding to a halt. I checked for a pulse I knew wasn't there, then pulled the quilt up to his chin. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for an hour, numb, processing the fact that I was now the last Mitchell on the property. My first instinct wasn't to call the funeral home or the doctor. My first instinct was that I had to notify the rest of the family, and the only family he had left was waiting in the woods. I walked out onto the back porch, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The thermometer read 12 degrees. I didn't turn on the floodlight. I just stood by the screen and looked toward the stump. He's gone, I whispered into the darkness. James is gone. It felt ridiculous to speak to the trees, but I knew he was out there. The guardian had been hovering closer to the house lately, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Animals know when death is in the room. They smell the change in pheromones. They feel the drop in energy. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. From the deep shadows of the pine line, the massive shape detached itself. He didn't walk with his usual caution. He moved heavily, dragging his feet through the crust of snow. He came right up to the edge of the porch light's reach, closer than he had ever been. He looked at the empty rocking chair, then at me, then back at the chair. He let out a sound that I will carry to my grave, a sharp intake of breath followed by a low, shuddering exhale. It was the universal sound of a heart breaking. He didn't leave. He settled onto the frozen ground right there in the yard, ignoring his usual stump. He sat cross-legged in the snow, facing the house, like a sentry guarding a fallen king. I pulled a chair up to the screen and sat with him. We didn't speak. There were no stories to tell tonight. We just sat in the biting cold, two witnesses to the end of an era. I drank whiskey to keep warm. He just sat there, a mountain of fur and grief, letting the frost settle on his shoulders. As the sun rose, the reality of the logistics set in. The coroner's van would be coming. I had to manage the human rituals of death. "You have to go," I told him through the screen. "People are coming." He understood the tone, if not the words. He retreated into the tree line, but he didn't leave. I could see him moving in the brush, a gray shadow pacing the perimeter. He watched as they carried the body out. He watched the hearse drive away. He was ensuring the safe passage of his friend's vessel. When the house was quiet again that evening, he returned. He took up his post on the stump. This time, the silence was broken by vocalizations. It wasn't the chuffing of conversation. It was a keening, a high-pitched melodic wail that rose and fell in a minor key. It sounded like whale song broadcast through the forest. It was a funeral dirge. I sat on the porch and let the tears finally come, triggered by the raw, unfiltered mourning of a creature that had no societal constraints on its grief. He cried for both of us. The vigil lasted for 3 days. The creature didn't appear to eat. I left apples on the rail, but they remained untouched, freezing into red spheres of ice. He was fasting. He sat through a snowstorm on the second night, becoming a white mound in the darkness, refusing to seek shelter. It was a display of loyalty that shamed most humans I knew. He was honoring a pact. He was waiting for the spirit to settle, or perhaps he was simply unable to say goodbye to the only connection he had to the world of men. I realized during those long nights that I was mourning two deaths. I was mourning my father, but I was also mourning the end of this impossible friendship. With James gone, the bridge was out. I was a stranger again. The creature had tolerated me because of James. Without him, we had no common language. I looked at the guardian and saw his age, his frailty. and I knew he would go back to the deep woods and die alone. The tragedy of the moment was absolute. On the third morning, the sun broke through the clouds with a blinding brilliance. The creature stood up. He shook the snow from his coat, a cloud of powder exploding around him. He walked up to the porch screen, so close I could smell the pine and the wet fur. He raised a massive hand and pressed his palm against the wire mesh. I instinctively placed my hand on the other side, matching his palm. His hand dwarfed mine, the heat radiating through the metal. It was a goodbye. It was a transfer of custody. He looked me in the eye, and the amber glow was dull, washed out by exhaustion. He made a soft clicking sound in his throat, then turned. He didn't look back. He walked toward the tree line with that heavy, limping gait, disappearing into the shadows of the hemlocks. I watched until the forest swallowed him whole. The yard was empty. The stump was just a stump. The magic had departed with the soul of my father, leaving me with a silent house and a cold, empty field. I walked back into the living room, the house feeling larger and emptier than before. My eyes fell on the stack of VHS tapes on the shelf, 60 hours of footage labeled with dates and times. I had recorded the vigil. I had recorded the dirge. I had the entire history of the phenomenon sitting in plastic cases. I realized then that my father's legacy wasn't the farm or the bank account. It was the proof. I held the evidence of a miracle in my hands, and I had to decide what to do with a secret that could change the world or destroy a friend. The 12 VHS tapes sat in a fireproof safe in my basement for 28 years. They were the most dangerous objects I owned. Every time I looked at the black plastic spines, I felt the pull of temptation. I could have gone to the press. I could have been the man who proved the existence of Sasquatch. I could have been famous. But every time I reached for the dial of the safe, I remembered the creature's hand on the screen and the trust in my father's eyes. To release the footage was to paint a target on the back of the only friend my father had left. Fame would have cost me my soul. I did consult an expert tentatively in the late 90s. I met with a primate biologist under the guise of a hypothetical scenario. What would happen, I asked, if a distinct population was found in a populated area? His answer was chilling. He spoke of containment zones, invasive tagging, and the likely collapse of the local ecosystem due to human intrusion. He confirmed my worst fears. Science wouldn't study the guardian, it would dissect him. The machine of curiosity is ruthless. I realized that the greatest act of conservation I could perform was silence. Life moved on, as it does. I sold the farmhouse in 2005, but I placed a conservation easement on the 80 acres of woodland behind it. I set it up so that the land could never be developed, logged, or hunted. It was my final gift to the guardian, a legal fortress to ensure that even if he was gone, his descendants, the little ones my father asked about, would have a sanctuary. I walked the perimeter one last time before I handed over the keys, hoping for a glimpse, but the woods were quiet. The treaty had ended with James. Time is a flat circle, and irony is its cruelest joke. In 2023, at the age of 80, I found myself standing in the middle of my kitchen, holding a carton of milk, unable to remember why I was there. The fog had come for me. The diagnosis was early onset Alzheimer's, the same genetic curse that had taken James. As I sat in the doctor's office listening to the prognosis, I didn't feel fear. I felt a sense of urgency. I knew what was coming, the erasing of the self. And I knew I couldn't leave the tapes in a basement safe to be found by an estate sale liquidator. I reached out to the Weill Cornell Memory Disorders Clinic, not to the biology department. I wasn't offering them a monster. I was offering them a medical anomaly. I told them I had longitudinal video data of an advanced dementia patient showing spontaneous radical cognitive recovery in response to a unique environmental stimulus. I negotiated the terms for months. The identity of the stimulus had to be redacted from public findings. The location had to be sealed. The tapes were to be treated as medical records, not biological proof. When the research team finally viewed the footage, the reaction was stunned silence. They didn't gasp at the Bigfoot, they gasped at the data. They watched James transition from aphasic murmuring to complex storytelling in real time. They saw the empirical evidence of a brain bypassing its own damage. One neurologist wept. She said it challenged the fundamental understanding of neurodegeneration. They had believed the lights were out. The tapes proved the bulb was fine, but the switch was stuck. The study, published quietly under the title, The Mitchell Anomalies, revolutionized the field. It proposed that extreme emotional engagement and high-stakes novelty, the sheer awe of interacting with a non-human intelligence, could trigger a release of neurochemicals that temporarily restored function. It wasn't a cure, but it was a window. It proved that the person is still in there, trapped behind the plaque, waiting for a connection strong enough to break down the door. My father wasn't gone. He was just waiting for the right conversation. The researchers respected my conditions. In the papers, the guardian is referred to as the novelty subject. Images of him are blurred, described only as a large biological entity inducing a fear-awe response. The cryptozoologists never found the paper because they don't read neurology journals. The secret held. I had managed to advance the science of the human mind without sacrificing the safety of the wild. It was the threading of a needle that took me 3 decades to perfect. Now, as I sit in my own assisted living facility, the edges of my world are starting to fray. I have trouble with names. I lose the thread of conversations. But I am not afraid. I have the comfort of knowing that my father's suffering wasn't meaningless. His twilight years, spent on that porch with his friend, have given hope to millions of families. The Mitchell protocol, using high-engagement therapy, is now a standard of care. We stopped treating them like vegetables and started treating them like explorers. I have a copy of the tapes here in my room, though I no longer have a VCR to play them. I don't need to watch them. I can close my eyes and see it perfectly. I see the fireflies dancing in the humid air. I see the glow of the porch light. I see my father, young again in spirit, laughing at a joke told by a giant. I see the bridge between 2 worlds, built on the foundation of a simple, impossible friendship. Sometimes, late at night, when the hallway is quiet and the nurses are at the station, I look out my window at the small patch of trees in the courtyard. I know he's not there. The guardian is long gone, returned to the earth. But in the fog of my own mind, I find myself waiting. I find myself hoping that when the memories finally fade completely, and I am left in the dark, I might look up and see a shadow sitting on a stump, waiting to guide me home. The evidence is hidden, but the truth is written in the textbooks. We are not alone in our minds, and we are not alone in the woods. The greatest discovery wasn't that Bigfoot exists. It was that he was human enough to care for a dying man when his own species couldn't reach him. The monster was the cure. And as the lights go out for me, I take comfort in knowing that somewhere deep in the Pennsylvania forests, the legacy of that kindness is still walking through the snow, leaving footprints that no one needs to find.